What happens when a late-night talk show host pushes America's most respected former president too far? Tonight, we're diving into the shocking confrontation that left Barack Obama walking off the Jimmy Kimmel Live set after what started as a routine interview turned into television's most explosive political showdown. The cameras captured every heated exchange, every uncomfortable pause, and the moment when decades of political decorum completely shattered on live television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below with your thoughts on how this situation spiraled so completely out of control. The studio audience settled into their seats as the familiar theme music of Jimmy Kimmel Live filled the air. Jimmy Kimmel bounded onto the stage with his usual energy, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight. A certain edge that his regular viewers might have missed, but would soon become impossible to ignore. The applause died down as Jimmy launched into his monologue, making his typical jabs at current events and celebrities, but his jokes seemed sharper tonight, more pointed, and when he mentioned that former President Barack Obama would be his guest, there was an almost predatory gleam in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy announced with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "please welcome the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama." The audience erupted in applause as Obama walked onto the stage, his characteristic smile warm and genuine as he waved to the crowd. He looked relaxed in his dark suit, moving with the easy confidence that had made him one of America's most charismatic leaders. The two men shook hands, and Obama took his seat across from Jimmy's desk, settling in with the practiced ease of someone who had done countless interviews over the years. "Mr. President, thank you so much for being here," Jimmy began, his tone still friendly, but with an undertone that suggested this wouldn't be the typical softball interview Obama was accustomed to. "I have to say, it's always fascinating to have someone of your stature on the show, especially given everything that's been happening in politics lately." Obama nodded graciously, his hands folded in his lap as he prepared to engage in what he assumed would be another routine promotional appearance. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and your audience." Obama's voice carried its familiar cadence, measured and thoughtful. But Jimmy was already shifting in his chair, his body language becoming more aggressive as he leaned forward. "You know, Mr. President, I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately," Jimmy said, his smile becoming more forced. "And I can't help but wonder, when you look back at your 8 years in office, do you ever feel like you were just, well, in over your head?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge, and the studio audience fell noticeably quieter, sensing the shift in tone. Obama's eyebrows raised slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I think any president faces enormous challenges, Jimmy. The office itself is humbling, and I certainly learned something new every single day. But I'm proud of what we accomplished, from healthcare reform to economic recovery, to restoring America's standing in the world." Jimmy's laugh had a harsh edge to it. "Restoring America's standing? That's interesting, because I've been looking at some numbers, and it seems like a lot of Americans felt pretty abandoned during your administration. I mean, let's be honest, the hope and change thing was a nice campaign slogan. But what did it really amount to?" The former president's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Jimmy, I think if you look at the actual data, unemployment dropped from over 10% to under 5% during my time in office. We pulled the country out of the worst recession since the Great Depression, expanded healthcare coverage to millions of Americans who couldn't get it before. And yes, we restored relationships with allies that had been badly damaged." "Right, but at what cost?" Jimmy pressed, his tone becoming more confrontational. "I mean, you talk about healthcare, but what about all the people who lost their doctors, lost their plans? What about the small businesses that couldn't afford the new regulations?" It seems like your version of helping people involved making life harder for a whole lot of other people. Obama leaned back slightly, his media training kicking in, as he recognized this wasn't going to be the friendly chat he'd expected. Jimmy, I think that's a pretty narrow way to look at complex policy issues. Healthcare reform was never going to be perfect, but it was necessary. We had people dying because they couldn't afford treatment, people going bankrupt because of medical bills. Sometimes doing the right thing means making difficult choices. Difficult choices, Jimmy repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. Is that what you call drone strikes? Is that what you call deporting more immigrants than any president before you? Is that what you call watching American cities burn while you talked about hope? The audience was now completely silent, the tension in the room palpable as Jimmy's assault continued. Obama's composure was beginning to crack, his jaw working as he fought to maintain his diplomatic demeanor. Jimmy, I'm not sure what's gotten into you tonight, but these are serious issues that deserve serious discussion, not cheap political attacks. If you want to have a real conversation about the complexities of governing, I'm happy to do that. Oh, I'm sorry, Jimmy said with mock concern. Am I being too real for you? Is this not the kind of interview you're used to, where everyone just tells you how wonderful you are? Because I think the American people deserve to hear some hard truths about your presidency, don't you? The former president's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice level. What I think the American people deserve is honest, respectful dialogue about the issues that matter to them, not whatever this performance is supposed to be. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk crossing his face. Performance? This isn't a performance, Mr. President. This is me asking the questions that other people are too starstruck to ask. Like, why did you think it was okay to use the IRS to target conservative groups? Why did you think it was okay to spy on journalists? Why did you think it was okay to leave 4 Americans to die in Benghazi? The audience gasped audibly as Jimmy threw out the inflammatory accusations, and Obama's face darkened considerably. Jimmy, those are serious allegations that have been investigated thoroughly by Republican and Democratic committees alike. If you're going to make charges like that, you better have your facts straight. My facts are straight, Jimmy shot back, his voice rising. The facts are that your administration was scandal after scandal, but the media was so in love with you that they never held you accountable. Fast and Furious, the VA scandal, Hillary's emails that you knew about, the Iran deal that you pushed through without congressional approval. Should I keep going? Obama stood up abruptly, his patience finally exhausted. You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight thinking we were going to have a civil conversation, but it's clear you have some kind of agenda here that has nothing to do with honest journalism or entertaining your audience. Jimmy's eyes lit up as he sensed he was getting under the former president's skin. Agenda? My agenda is the truth, something your administration seemed to have a pretty casual relationship with. I mean, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, right? How did that work out? The former president's voice rose for the first time, his famous cool finally breaking. That's enough, Jimmy. I don't know what game you think you're playing here, but I'm not going to sit here and let you spread lies and conspiracy theories for your ratings. Conspiracy theories? Jimmy laughed harshly. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are facts that your friends in the media chose to ignore. But I guess when you're not getting softball questions from your buddies, you don't know how to handle it, do you? Obama pointed a finger at Jimmy, his composure completely gone now. You want to talk about facts? Here's a fact for you. You're a talk show host who makes jokes for a living, and you think that qualifies you to lecture a former president about governance and policy. You think your little rants on late-night television make you some kind of journalist? The insult hit its mark, and Jimmy's face flushed red. At least I'm honest about what I do. I don't pretend to be something I'm not. Unlike some people who campaign on transparency, and then run the most secretive administration in modern history. Secretive? Obama's voice was incredulous now. You want to talk about secretive? What about your complete lack of research for this interview? What about the fact that you're clearly reading from someone else's talking points? Who's feeding you these questions, Jimmy? Because they sure as hell didn't come from you. Jimmy's face turned an even deeper shade of red as Obama's accusation hit home. Nobody's feeding me anything, he snapped, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying his discomfort. These are questions that millions of Americans have been asking for years. But nobody in your precious mainstream media had the guts to ask them. Obama shook his head in disgust. You know what this is really about, don't you, Jimmy? This isn't about asking tough questions or holding anyone accountable. This is about you trying to make a name for yourself by ambushing a guest who came here in good faith. You think tearing down a former president is going to make you relevant? Relevant? Jimmy stood up behind his desk, his voice rising to match Obama's intensity. I've been relevant for 20 years, while you've been running around giving speeches for $500,000 a pop. At least when I make money, I'm honest about entertaining people instead of pretending I'm still serving the public. The audience was shifting uncomfortably in their seats now, many looking around as if wondering whether they should leave. This had gone far beyond the bounds of normal television, even for a late-night talk show known for its political content. Obama's security detail, positioned just off camera, had moved closer to the stage, their hands near their jackets as they assessed the deteriorating situation. You want to talk about honesty? Obama's voice was now filled with barely controlled fury. Let's talk about the honesty of inviting someone onto your show under false pretenses. Let's talk about the honesty of ambushing a guest with a coordinated attack instead of having the decency to tell them what kind of interview this was going to be. Jimmy came around from behind his desk, moving closer to Obama, in a gesture that was clearly meant to be intimidating. False pretenses? I invited you here to answer questions, and that's exactly what I'm doing. Just because you're not used to anyone challenging your precious narrative doesn't mean I'm being dishonest. Challenging my narrative? Obama laughed bitterly. Jimmy, you haven't challenged anything. You've just thrown out a bunch of right-wing talking points without any context or nuance. You're not a journalist. You're not even a good entertainer right now. You're just a man having a very public meltdown on television. The insult clearly stung Jimmy, and his composure slipped further. Meltdown? I'm not the one who can't handle a few tough questions without throwing a tantrum. I'm not the one who's so used to being treated like royalty that I can't deal with actual scrutiny. Obama stepped closer to Jimmy, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried throughout the silent studio. You want to see a tantrum, Jimmy? You want to see what happens when someone finally calls you out for the hack you really are? Because I can tell you right now, this isn't journalism, this isn't entertainment. This is just sad. Sad? Jimmy's voice cracked again, but he pressed on. You know what's sad? A former president who can't defend his own record without attacking the person asking the questions. You know what's sad? Someone who campaigned on bringing people together, but can't handle one conversation without losing his cool. The former president's eyes narrowed dangerously. I've handled conversations with dictators and terrorists with more grace than you're showing right now. I've negotiated with people who actually wanted to destroy America, and somehow they showed more respect for the office than you're showing tonight. Respect for the office? Jimmy's laugh was harsh and bitter. That's rich coming from someone who spent 8 years apologizing for America everywhere he went. That's rich coming from someone who bowed to foreign leaders and acted like our country was something to be ashamed of. Obama's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea what it means to represent this country on the world stage, to make decisions that affect millions of lives, to carry the weight of the presidency. And you sure as hell have no right to question my patriotism. Patriotism. Jimmy stepped even closer, his face now inches from Obama's. Is that what you call it when you ship pallets of cash to Iran? Is that what you call it when you tell Russia you'll have more flexibility after the election? Is that what you call it when you fundamentally transform America into something the founders wouldn't recognize? The Secret Service agents were now moving onto the stage, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond their comfort level. Obama waved them back with a sharp gesture, his eyes never leaving Jimmy's face. You're quoting sound bites and talking points like some amateur political blogger. You don't understand the first thing about foreign policy or diplomacy. I understand enough to know when someone's selling out their own country. Jimmy shot back, his voice now shaking with emotion. I understand enough to know when someone's more concerned with their image in Europe than their responsibility to America. Obama's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. You just crossed a line that you can't uncross, Jimmy. You just accused a former president of treason on national television without a shred of evidence or understanding. Truth isn't treason, Jimmy replied, but his voice lacked conviction, now as if he was beginning to realize how far this had gone. Facts aren't treason, no matter how much they hurt your feelings. Facts? Obama's laugh was cold and humorless. You wouldn't know a fact if it bit you in the ass. You're spouting conspiracy theories and partisan attacks that have been debunked 1,000 times by people who actually know what they're talking about. The studio audience was now completely silent, many covering their mouths in shock at what they were witnessing. This had gone beyond uncomfortable television into something that felt genuinely dangerous. A confrontation between two powerful men who had completely lost control of the situation. Jimmy's face was now pale beneath the studio lights, but he wasn't backing down. Debunked by who? By the same media that covered for you for 8 years? By the same people who are still covering for you now? Give me a break. You want a break? Obama's voice was filled with contempt. Here's your break. I'm done with this charade. I'm done pretending that this is anything other than a hit job disguised as an interview. And I'm done pretending that you deserve any respect after the way you've conducted yourself tonight. Jimmy's hands were shaking now, but he pressed on with his attack. Hit job? This is called accountability, something you've managed to avoid your entire political career. This is called asking the hard questions that your media friends were too cowardly to ask. Accountability? Obama stepped back slightly, his voice filled with disgust. You think this is accountability? This is an ambush by a failed comedian who thinks he can build his career by tearing down people who actually accomplished something with their lives. The insult about being a failed comedian hit Jimmy like a physical blow, and his face contorted with rage. Failed comedian? I've been successful longer than you've been in politics. I've built something real while you've been living off taxpayer money and book deals. Obama's eyes flashed with fury. You've built what exactly? A career making jokes about people who actually do the work. A platform that you're now using to spread lies and conspiracy theories? That's your great accomplishment? At least I'm honest about what I do, Jimmy screamed, his voice echoing through the studio. At least I don't pretend to be some great statesman while I'm selling out my country behind closed doors. At least I don't lecture people about unity while I'm dividing them every chance I get. Obama took a step toward Jimmy, his voice deadly quiet. You want to talk about dividing people? Look around this studio right now. Look at what you've done here tonight. You've turned what should have been a civil conversation into a circus. And for what? For ratings? For attention? For your ego? Jimmy's face was now streaming with sweat under the hot studio lights, but his anger was driving him forward. My ego? That's incredible coming from someone who thinks he's still president, someone who can't stop inserting himself into every political conversation, like he's still relevant. Obama's voice was ice cold now, each word measured and deliberate. You know what, Jimmy? You've shown everyone here tonight exactly who you really are. You've shown them that underneath all the jokes and the fake charm, you're just another angry, bitter man who can't stand the fact that other people have actually made a difference in the world. Made a difference? Jimmy's voice cracked with hysteria. You made a difference, all right. You made things worse for millions of Americans. You made it harder for people to find jobs, harder for them to afford health care, harder for them to feel safe in their own country. The former president shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disgust and pity. You really believe that, don't you? You've actually convinced yourself that your talking points are reality. It's almost sad, watching someone destroy their own credibility in real time. Jimmy wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, his shirt now visibly damp. Credibility? You want to talk about credibility? How about the credibility of someone who promised transparency and then classified everything? How about the credibility of someone who said he'd bring people together and then spent 8 years playing identity politics? Obama's laugh was bitter and exhausted. Identity politics? Jimmy, the only person playing politics here tonight is you. You've turned this interview into some kind of right-wing fever dream, and you don't even seem to realize how completely you've embarrassed yourself. Embarrassed myself? Jimmy's voice rose to almost a shriek. I'm not the one who can't handle being asked real questions. I'm not the one who's melting down because someone finally held me accountable for my failures. The Secret Service agents were now positioned clearly in camera view, their tension obvious as they watched the confrontation continue to escalate. Several audience members had already gotten up and left, unwilling to witness whatever this was becoming. Obama looked directly into the nearest camera, his voice cutting through Jimmy's hysteria. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you've had to witness this. This isn't what American discourse should look like, and it's certainly not what you deserve from your entertainment. Jimmy spun toward the same camera, his face red and distorted, with rage. Don't apologize for me. I'm giving these people something they've never seen before. Honesty about your presidency. Honesty about your record. Honesty about who you really are when someone isn't kissing your ass. Obama turned back to Jimmy, his voice filled with finality. You know what, Jimmy? You're right about one thing. These people are seeing exactly who we really are tonight. They're seeing what I look like when I'm pushed beyond reasonable limits by someone who has no respect for civil discourse. And they're seeing what you look like when you let your hatred consume your judgment. Hatred? Jimmy's voice was now hoarse from yelling. This isn't hatred, this is justice. This is finally giving the American people the confrontation they've been waiting for. This is someone finally having the guts to tell you to your face what millions of people have been thinking for years. Obama picked up his water glass from the side table and took a slow sip, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. You think millions of people have been thinking this? You think this performance tonight represents some kind of popular sentiment? Jimmy, you're living in a bubble of your own creation. Bubble! Jimmy gestured wildly at the audience. Look around you. These people are finally seeing you without your teleprompter, without your handlers, without your carefully scripted responses. They're seeing the real Barack Obama, and you can't stand it. The former president set down his glass and straightened his tie, his movements deliberate and controlled. You're absolutely right, Jimmy. They are seeing the real me. They're seeing someone who came here in good faith to have a conversation, someone who tried to maintain dignity in the face of an unprecedented attack, and someone who finally reached the point where enough is enough. Jimmy stepped closer again, his voice now a harsh whisper. That's right, enough is enough. Enough of the lies, enough of the cover-ups, enough of pretending that your presidency was anything other than a disaster. For America. Obama looked Jimmy directly in the eyes, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority. You want to know what a real disaster looks like? It looks like a talk show host so desperate for relevance that he's willing to destroy his own show, alienate his audience, and humiliate himself on national television, just to get attention. The words hit Jimmy like a slap, and for a moment he was speechless, his mouth working but no sound coming out. The studio was dead silent except for the hum of the cameras and the shuffling of the few remaining audience members. When Jimmy finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. You think you can just walk in here and talk down to me like I'm nothing? You think your fancy words and your cool demeanor make you better than everyone else? Obama's response was measured and final. I think I'm someone who served his country for 8 years and tried to leave it better than I found it. I think I'm someone who came here tonight to have a respectful conversation and instead found myself in the middle of whatever personal crisis you're having. And I think I'm someone who has better things to do than continue this charade. He turned toward the exit, but Jimmy's voice stopped him. That's right. Walk away. Run away like you always do when things get tough. Show everyone what kind of leader you really were. Obama paused without turning around, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. Jimmy, I've faced down dictators, terrorists, economic collapse, and natural disasters. I've been tested by Congress, the courts, and the American people themselves. But I've never encountered anything quite as pathetic as what I've witnessed here tonight. He began walking toward the stage exit again, but Jimmy wasn't finished. Pathetic? You want to see pathetic? Pathetic is a president who apologized for America everywhere he went. Pathetic is a leader who made excuses instead of taking responsibility. Obama stopped and turned back one final time, his expression a mixture of anger and genuine sadness. You know what's truly pathetic, Jimmy? It's watching someone throw away their career, their reputation, and their dignity for 15 minutes of controversy. It's watching someone choose hatred over humanity, division over dialogue. Jimmy's face crumpled slightly, but his voice remained defiant. I didn't throw anything away. I finally showed people who I really am, someone who isn't afraid to ask the hard questions, someone who isn't intimidated by fancy titles and smooth talking. No, Jimmy, Obama said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality. You showed people exactly who you are, and that's something you're going to have to live with long after tonight's ratings are forgotten. With that, the former president walked off the stage, his Secret Service detail closing ranks around him as they headed for the exit. Jimmy stood alone, under the bright lights, his chest heaving, sweat staining his shirt, facing an audience that was staring at him in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling as Jimmy looked around the studio, seeming to realize for the first time the magnitude of what had just occurred. His mouth opened and closed several times as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. The silence stretched on, broken only by the mechanical hum of the television equipment and the distant sound of car doors slamming in the parking lot outside. What did you think of this explosive confrontation between two of America's most recognizable figures? Was Jimmy Kimmel right to push for answers, or did he cross a line that should never be crossed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that reveal what really happens when the cameras are rolling and the gloves come off.